Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 10th UGLO Open University session, where we focus on subjects related to global health. Today's topics are ethics and global health issues. I would like to introduce today's guest, Professor Rui Nunes, a full professor of bioethics at the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Porto. If you have any questions for our lecturer, leave them in the comments below. We will be holding a short Q&A session following the lecture. Professor Nunes, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Susanna, for your presentation and also for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here. As it was told, I'm a physician, I'm a professor of bioethics at the University of Porto. So I'm going to approach this issue of global health and ethics. Of course, it is a very large subject, but nevertheless, I'm going to make my presentation that I expect that it is a short one because it is probably more useful to all of you to make some questions and I will try to answer them. My presentation will be on several aspects of global health and ethics and the interface between the two of them, namely in this context of a post-pandemic world. So it is not possible to speak of global health today in 2021 without speaking of the COVID-19 pandemic. Because it is a pandemic that still goes on, first of all, and secondly, because it paved the way to a new way of thinking global justice and global health, taking into account that we all in Europe and elsewhere must be completely sure that there are several global problems that will need specifically global answers. So this is the context I'm going to make my presentation, and I'm going to point out one or two subjects related to this context. Then I will go to the perspectives that I feel that we should go on working if you want to success in Europe and elsewhere. And also, in the end, I will bring about some challenges that we still don't have an ethical answer, but nevertheless, we in Europe probably have a special responsibility due to the fact that we are in a democratic, an advanced democratic society. Of course, 27 societies, but the global European society, we have a special responsibility of paving the way to a new form of dealing with ethics and global health. So I would say that, first of all, this pandemic showed very clearly that, again, we have global problems. Global problems that will be enhanced for the better and for the worse, also with the digital transition that we are now at hand. Of course, that new technology, information and technology techniques and new ways of communicating with each other is very, very helpful. If it was not these ICTs, probably this lecture would not happen. But again, if it brings us together in Europe and at the global level, nevertheless, there are very important issues that we should address from an ethical perspective. So again, there are many important evolutions regarding these new technologies and the digital transition. But we must deal specifically with issues such as big data. How do we, in a global perspective, in a global health perspective, will deal with big data, leak data, so data that is gathered from very different settings, namely in the healthcare setting, and for physicians and other health professionals that are listening to this talk. we should take into account that we have the responsibility, the ethical and legal responsibility of protecting this data that patients provide to us and that we then deliver to the health digital system. But nevertheless, as a society, as a modern society, we should be very careful on how to deal with this huge amount of data that is gathered from very different ways, but nevertheless will have some importance in the future. It should be protected, and the international law and international ethical guidelines should help deal with these issues. Of course, it might have many important positive aspects, for instance, in public health or epidemiology, but nevertheless, there are very strong ethical issues regarding, for instance, a fundamental basic human right that is protection of personal privacy. Privacy is one of the most basic rights of the human person, because, as you know, you all know, that after World War II, there was a huge international consensus that we can see in international conventions and declarations, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UNESCO Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights, for instance, the Convention on Human Rights and Biomedicine of the Council of Europe, and many other ethical and legal instruments. And these international guidelines and conventions and declarations have one mainstream, and the mainstream is to respect human persons, to respect his or her intrinsic dignity, their fundamental rights, and the most fundamental rights of any person is precisely the right of self-determination, so autonomy of the person on the one hand, and protection and privacy on the other hand. Of course, there are many other fundamental rights, of course, but from this bioethical perspective and this evolution that we see in a global health perspective, I would claim that it is very, very important as we, as citizens, as intellectuals, as professionals, have a specific concern respecting personal privacy that, of course, this digital transition puts us at stake. It is not only the existence of large amounts of data, it is also the problem of artificial intelligence. It's a huge bioethical problem for very different reasons that I will not have the time to approach. But again, artificial intelligence with quantum computing, as you know, will pave the way to an easier access to personal data. So I think that it is very, very important, this digital transition, but with very strong ethical guidelines. Some examples, and very important examples here in Europe. For instance, the green passport. I will state only two examples. The green passport, or the COVID-19 green certificate that we in Europe are mandated to have, so that we can circulate from one country to another. Of course, it is a very important tool that enables us to go from one country to another, and we don't want to have lockdowns eternally, but nevertheless, there were some specific ethical problems that the European Union dealt with very well, but nevertheless, they existed. For instance, questions related to equality, because not all people were vaccinated against COVID-19. Problems of safeguard of privacy was our data that are in the Green Passport dealt with and protected. Is it in European countries? It is outside European countries? Are there digital infrastructures to protect that data? And questions similar to this one. So this is a very good example of an instrument, very important, at least in the European Union, but on the other hand, also an instrument that has serious ethical questions that, again, I think were very well dealt with. Another example, this digital transition in medicine paved the way for digital consent. As you know, for a medical procedure, we must gather consent for a surgical intervention or for a radiological examination. Well, with this transition that we are now enhanced in the European Union and elsewhere, of course, there is the possibility that this informed, expressed consent, free and informed consent, is in the digital way. This, again, has specific problems of protecting data, of assuring that the consent is exactly that, the consent from the patient. So it is a very good example also of the benefits, but also possible harms that this digital transition can bring about in Europe and all over the world. A second main conclusion that I could state regarding this evolution of the pandemic in Europe and in the world is that humanity is realizing that there are global public goods. And I think that nothing will remain the same after this pandemic. And it is not only regarding public health issues and global public health issues, but is regarding also other issues. For instance, issues regarding the environment, the policy, the world policy on water, migrations, the oceans, the protection of the oceans. So I feel that from an ethical perspective, we are now much more aware as global citizens that there are global problems, and of course global health is one of those problems, but it is not the only problem, but again it's a very important one, because if for instance regarding COVID-19, if all humanity is not well prepared and again vaccinated against COVID-19, of course that even countries that have a full scope of vaccination. In my country, Portugal, I'm very proud that we have 86% of the population completely vaccinated. So all the eligible population is vaccinated, but again, we are with an increasing number of cases because the borders are open, and so it is impossible to not allow people from coming from Africa, from South America, etc. So I think this is the pandemic in which global health is being developed. What are the perspectives? Well, first of all, I would say that ethics and global health also means that we should emphasize professional ethics. As a physician, again, I'm very proud that physicians, nurses, and all healthcare professionals in Portugal, in other European countries, all over the world, said with probably no exception that we are present to fight COVID-19. So it is a very good example how ethics works in everyday life, because there are no examples, at least that I know, that physicians or nurses refuse to treat patients, even with risk to their own lives, to their physical and psychological integrity. Burnout cases of professionals, of healthcare professionals, increased steadily during pandemic. Nevertheless, they were always present, and so this is also a lesson that we can learn, is that ethics is very important in every aspect of human life, but of course when we are dealing with patients and severe patients, of course ethics is more needed than ever. So This is a claim for what? For on the one hand, that the ethical curriculum in every area, not only in healthcare, but in every area of human endeavor, should be proposed and even going a step further than it is today. Of course, it is not only a question of teaching and learning, but also the example is very important. And I think the example that healthcare professionals gave to overall society, locally and international, was a very important one. So I would say that, again, this is a point that I would like to stress, that ethics is important, and global ethics and global health indeed need that individual persons, citizens and professionals abide to specific ethical principles. Another perspective that I'm going to point out is the problem of justice and non-discrimination in the access to health goods, to health care in particular. So I would say that, again, I'm very proud to be in Europe, to be an European, because Europe has a long-standing tradition of building a welfare state that tries not to discriminate anyone. So I think this is a very important issue from a civilization perspective, because, as you know, we are born equals in rights, in dignity before society, but in everything else we are different. We are different from a biological perspective. We are different from a genetic perspective. We are different from a social perspective. So a modern society is also a society that integrates people, all people, not discriminating men from women, youngsters from old people, persons due to their sexual orientation, etc. So this is also a fundamental value of Europe and of modern societies, this value that we should not discriminate anyone, and discriminate anyone in the access to healthcare. So again, I'm very, very proud to be in Europe, because European countries, all the 27 European countries, have very strong public systems, universal systems that precisely try to accommodate everyone without exception. And a question that we may put is, what would be what would happen in European countries in this pandemic if we did not have strong public financed healthcare services? And it is a very important issue, because it is now being studied that countries that do not have such a universal public system responded in a very worse manner to COVID-19 pandemic. So this leads to a conclusion that we should organize public health systems, that from a global health perspective, we should propose that all countries in the world should try to promote and to deliver healthcare services to their population. I will say in the end of my lecture that this is a very huge problem, because if we agree on the principles that healthcare access of appropriate quality is a human right, and it is a basic human right, but on the other hand, it is very difficult for many countries to deliver that access to everyone in society. Even in developed countries, in modern and advanced democracies, it is difficult, as you know. But nevertheless, we should have this goal in a realistic perspective, that we can organize all over the world a healthcare system that guarantees access to everyone without discrimination. Of course, a problem of healthcare systems is precisely that people become older, so there is a stronger need for healthcare. The resources are scarce, and I would say that from a global health perspective, we should very honestly beginning to deal with the issues of establishing and admitting ethical priorities in healthcare. It is a very complex philosophical and political issues, because it means that we should, in every country, to develop a system that, on the one hand, guarantees the access to anyone, but on the other hand, due to the scarcity of resources, it must make some choices and establish priorities with an ethical reasoning that is accepted, that is accountable to all population. If you want to, we might go further in this issue in the discussion. Again, in a society, we have rights, we have duties. I'll go in this issue in my conclusions regarding the universal vaccination with COVID-19 or with any other infectious disease. I would say that another strong priority in this interface between global health and ethics is the need for increasing education for health and health literacy. Of course, this is not a problem that is dissociated with the development of society, but probably there is no area in society that depends more on education than health. And I would say that it is an absolute priority to develop education for health and also education for values and bioethics. What do I mean by education for values and for bioethics? With no intention of making someone to lead to an ethical pathway, I would say that it would be very important to teach at schools, namely in children or adolescents with 14, 15 years old, I would say it would be very important to discuss freely, to discuss with a very good technical background, with sound scientific evidence. I would say that we could lead the schools to teach and youngsters to deal with issues of this bioethical global perspective, namely taking into account what it is claimed and defended in the international conventions that I just spoke of. For instance, speaking about issues such as human procreation, of the biology of procreation, and of course the family planning, issues such as abortion, the consequences of abortion, the way to prevent it. So all these issues, it is, I feel, an ethical imperative to discuss freely with no intellectual reserves, so that children and adolescents can discuss these issues and be better prepared for life, whatever the choices they may make in the future. And this should be, as I will claim later, this should be also that international organizations, namely UNESCO, namely UNICEF, should take into consideration. Of course, I know that this is not a Pacific issue. It is a very controversial one, namely in many other areas of our planet. But at least in Europe and in developed countries, I think that this should be taken into account and consideration. To finish, I would say that there are some challenges that global health has in the future, and these, of course, are ethical challenges. One of them is precisely the equilibrium, the balance that we should reach between individual rights, human rights, basic rights, and the public good, namely in a public pandemic, a global pandemic such as COVID-19. And this balance, this equilibrium is not easy to make. I can state that because I'm a member of one or two ethics committees in my country, university ethics committees, and I could see that sometimes the goal of reaching very fastly scientific results in research, namely in COVID-19, claiming that it is or it was a public health emergency, led to some compression of human rights and individual rights. And I think that one lesson, it is a challenge and should be a lesson that we should learn from this pandemic is precisely that it is not the fact that we are in a global public health emergency that should lead by that fact to a compression of human rights, both human rights in general as women human rights and minorities, etc. So we should take into account that a modern society, an advanced democracy, and I feel that's our goal, is to build modern and advanced democracies should have, after this pandemic, should propose specific guidelines related to this issue. Just one or two examples. Even in some European countries, not in Portugal, but in other countries, we saw the discussion, for instance, that this public health emergency and lack of resources of many healthcare systems led to the conclusion that it might be acceptable to discriminate people only because they are old age patients. Of course, that an ethics and bioethics, a world ethics that is grounded in human dignity, human rights, equality, and non-discrimination does not accept this kind of distinction. And so, of course, when resources are scarce, we must deal with them very efficiently, but the clinical aspects should always prevail regarding other arbitrary aspects that we can point out. Another example, I saw that in many circumstances, namely in research, it was claimed that in some cases it was not needed consent of the patients to do research because it was an emergency, a public health emergency, or in other cases I saw in my country and elsewhere that genetic databases and biobanks, large amounts of biological products that were collected for research projects and research purposes without the specific rules that a biobank needs, and it is furthermore stipulated by law. So a law in Portugal and in every European country has specific rules and guidelines regarding creating banks and collections of biological products, because one thing is sure, and I'm not sure that all of you are aware of this, but when even with consent for a research purpose, blood or other biological product is collected for a patient, the property of that biological product is still the patient that is the legitimate owner of that biological product. So what we can do with that product should be in accordance or with consent of the patient, or if it is not possible, must be very well explained why that consent was not obtained, because again, I feel that an emergency like this, even a very strong one, we all agree on that, but again, it should be balanced from an ethical perspective with individual rights. So 2 examples of how and when should we balance public health with individual rights. Second, a second challenge, and this is one of the major ethical problems in modern societies. It is the problem of disinformation. And we see that regarding COVID-19 vaccination. COVID-19 vaccination, as other kinds of vaccinations, such as measles and other diseases, that humanity with so strongly approach, and the international organizations also approach this problem of immunization of in entire societies, so that specific diseases would disappear from humanity. But it is a pity to see that without proper scientific evidence and with scientific misevidence, people all over the world are disinformed and therefore make choices that are not consistent with scientific evidence. I'm not claiming, to be very clear, I'm not claiming that people do not have the right to choose, to be very clear. But one thing is to have the right to choose, another thing is to choose in accordance with disinformation, with fake news, with evidence that does not exist. And so we in Europe and elsewhere should be very careful with that. As you know, in Europe, most countries have an action plan regarding disinformation. The social media is a severe problem, because it is very difficult to control fake scientific information in the social media. But nevertheless, I think it is a huge challenge for humanity. And of course, that leads to some perverse consequences. That is, for instance, people that in normal circumstances would like to be vaccinated against COVID-19, and they are not vaccinated because they don't believe, or they have been misinformed. So I think that we should do better than that. And probably, at least in Europe, we will have a 5th wave, it is in part due to that circumstance. Of course, that from an ethical perspective, I would not regard COVID-19 vaccination as a mandatory one, in the sense that people should be compulsory vaccinated against. That's not the case. This bioethics would not suggest that, but it would strongly suggest, again, that we as citizens, as full citizens, we have rights, but we have also obligations, duties, responsibilities to oneself, to our family, to the overall society. And so we should think it over when we do not want to be vaccinated, because again, it is not only my problem, it is our problem. And so again, I'm not defending mandatory vaccination, but a huge campaign of health literacy, so that people know that it is a communitary problem. And so we have also responsibilities to other people. Even someone like me that strongly believes in self-determination, in autonomy of the patient, the autonomy of the person, of the right to make choices in my life, But I must be also aware that those choices have consequences to others, and I must be full accountable for those choices. Finally, I would say that if we really want to think of global health as a new humanitarian endeavor, we should think it over regarding the role of international organizations. Of course, I'm a huge fan of international organizations, of the World Health Organization, the World Medical Association, etc. But we must think it in another way, because this pandemic showed some flaws in those international organizations, namely in the ones that had the responsibility of informing societies all over the world regarding the benefits of new pharmaceuticals, of vaccination, of simple things such as, or complex ones, such as the use of a mask in a community. So I think that there were some flaws, namely in gathering scientific evidence on the one hand, on the other hand, of communicating with societies, even in developed societies, in communicating in real time, not with a delay of 1, 2, or 3 weeks or months, this information. So I would claim that if we want the world to succeed, and we are all aware of what happened in the last days regarding world pacts and conventions regarding climate change and the need to protect the environment, because we have that responsibility not only to ourselves but to future generations. Thinking of ethics and global health also means that we have the responsibility of thinking of the rights and quality of life of future generations. Well, if we believe in this, we also believe, or should believe, that the world to succeed and the world to be a better one for future generations, and I think we all agree on that, should also empower international organizations. Of course, I'm not stating, I'm not an idealistic in this sense. I'm not stating that there should be a world government, because that is even in the midterm future an impossibility. But nevertheless, we should reinforce, we should empower international organizations so that different global governance arrangements are proposed and again have different consequences in the future regarding the pandemic, but many other global public goods and global public issues. So I will end with a positive, very positive note in Europe, because I was very happy to see that although, of course, the European Union is just part of the world, but nevertheless, I think that the steps that were given in the European Union space, namely by the European Commission, were very important ones. First of all, the European Union for Health, that in fact is in a smaller scale, something that could exist globally if we really believe in global health. And so I think this European Union for Health that has some principles, namely the principle that each individual state has the responsibility of organizing its own healthcare system, but nevertheless, as European citizens, we have also the right to benefit from European infrastructures, digital infrastructures, of benefiting of a new way of dealing with healthcare needs, namely of pharmaceuticals, of medical devices, of vaccines, so that this notion that globalization is a very important driver that balances the world, and not only the rich world and the poor world, because the world now is much less poorer than it was some 25 years ago. So I would not challenge the benefits of cultural and even of economic globalization, but nevertheless, we should in Europe have this notion that we cannot rely on a foreign country to supply our healthcare needs in an emergency or in a more common situation. So this pact between European countries to produce knowledge, that's what we are doing right now between different countries, different universities. It is a very important positive externality of this pandemic. So this pandemic was a terrifying problem all over the world. It still is, but nevertheless, at least in Europe, paved the way to common agreements so that the 27 states understand, and I think they believe, that there must be common answers and not answers of individual states, because together we are stronger than if each one of us is fighting for itself. Just to finish, I am also very happy to see that in Europe it was proposed a new cultural European Bauhaus. What does it mean? It means that culture is the essence of European culture, of European traditions, of European civilization model. And if we want to succeed, and if we want to be an example to other countries around the world, richer or poorer, of course, we must promote a full citizenship. And the full citizenship is not only about economics, is not only about even social rights, is also about education and culture. And indeed, that is the main consequences of the very famous Human Development Index that Amartya Sen, as you know, proposed some years ago. And I think it is a very important point to take into account, and I would like to finish with that a full human development in European countries as elsewhere, as at the global level, takes into account the economic development, the social development, the welfare state, the way how human rights are fulfilled, but all this evolution needs that people are strongly educated and have access and enjoy the culture of their country, the culture of Europe, the culture of the world. That is the way we will become really full human persons. So thank you very much. I think that my time just went out. And so now, if you want to make some questions, I will be very happy to take them.
Thank you, Professor Nunes, for this engaging presentation. I believe we touched very interesting topics, and I think our audience thinks likewise because we received some questions to you. I believe you touched some of them during the presentation, but I will read them out nonetheless. So the first question is, does a general ethical approach exist within the EU or the world, or does it change by country to country?
Okay, it's a very interesting issue, and again, I will try to answer it. I think that it is not an impossibility to have global ethical principles and standards respecting the specificities of each culture. Of course, it is difficult, but it is possible. And why is it possible? Because I feel that full human persons, responsible persons, educated persons, all understand that we do not accept anymore the imposition of a view of moral life. So, developed people, men and women, since birth, namely through education, in family life, at school, at university, etc., builds his or her own ethical personality. So mine is different from any other person. But take into account this perspective that modern societies, namely democratic societies, are societies that are the convergence of different ethical points of views. Nevertheless, we can agree by mutual consent, we can agree on specific ethical principles. So I'm not suggesting, such as in the past, that those principles should be imposed on others, but might be discussed and agreed on. So if we agree, for instance, that every human person, such as myself, Susanna, or anyone that is listening to us, is a human person, a full human person, with full human dignity, with intrinsic value, that should be entitled to live in accordance with their own his or her own set of values. If we agree on that, this is a very nice starting point for a global ethics that will lead to a global society that agrees in specific principles. If we agree that every human person should not be discriminated against, again, it is not imposed, but it is negotiated. We agree on that. Well, of course, public policies will reflect nationally and internationally these practices. But there is also room and scope for some different opinions. And of course, for instance, at the Netherlands, in Belgium, Luxembourg, now also in Italy, in Spain, now even as we speak also in Portugal, we have legalized euthanasia, active euthanasia. Well, I'm not suggesting that other countries, even in Europe, should go on the same way, because this is an evolution that some societies want to take for themselves, and others do not want it. But this does not mean that we cannot reach an agreement regarding a common set of ethical principles in medicine, ethical principles regarding the environment, ethical principles regarding protection of animal life. Of course, we can have different perspectives regarding protecting animals. Some people defend from a bioethical perspective that animals have rights, or at least some sentient animals do have rights. Some claim, others feel that they don't have rights, but nevertheless, they should be protected. So we can agree on principles and practices, even if we have disagreement in other principles and practices. And in fact, this is what international organizations try to do, and international bodies, when they approve international conventions, these conventions are the minimal, the common agreement between different societies regarding specific issues. For instance, when the Convention on the European Union, the European Union Convention on Human Rights and Biomedicine, agreed on specific ethical principles in biomedicine, there was still the problem of the status of the human embryo. Of course, the status, the ontological, the ethical status of the human embryo, regarding, for instance, abortion or in vitro fertilization and embryo transfer, or embryo manipulation, etc., is a very disruptive problem in every country in the world. So we don't expect that in specific issues that we reach an agreement. But again, we can reach an agreement in many other aspects of moral life, of ethical life, so that in modern societies we know these ethical rules. And then every society, every specific society, then has the task to interpret those principles according to their own traditions and perspectives. So it is not impossible to finish to have a common agreement in global ethical principles and values, and of course to have specificities of each society, even in Europe. Of course, that if we were speaking in a global setting, the problem would be even greater. But nevertheless, humanity gave a very huge step when in 1948 approved the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that every state in the world approved. So it is possible, this kind of agreement, of common agreement. We are speaking of a society of consent, not a society where values are imposed, but are exposed, are shared, and then each one of us develops his or her perspective of the ethical life.
Thank you. Actually, you then again touched a topic which another question was about, which was regarding euthanasia. As it is only available in a couple of countries within the world, does it interfere with medical ethical rights?
Yes, this is a very important issue. It is not only euthanasia. For instance, the 14th World Conference on Bioethics, Medical Ethics and Health Law that will be held here in Porto in 7-10 March next year, we'll have a specific panel of the World Medical Association regarding the Code of Ethics physicians. And one of the topics is precisely objection of consciousness regarding, for instance, not only euthanasia, but abortion. So this does not mean that, on the one hand, as a global society, as a modern society, as an inclusive society, we cannot, by mutual agreement, we cannot build an ethical framework that is shared globally, with global principles that we can see in international conventions and declarations. But on the other hand, we have, as physicians, I'm a physician, we have a strong commitment with some medical ethical principles. For instance, in Portugal, we still have every single year the Hippocratical Oath. So every physician, every year, when he or she is a graduate and becomes a physician, a certified physician, he makes the Hippocratic Oath. So he or she is compelled to abide to specific principles of medical ethics. And as you know, since Hippocratic times, more than 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, that physicians have the responsibility of respecting life. Again, this is possible to reconcile because, as you know, we live in the rule of law. We live in a democracy, all of us. We live in a society where laws are approved by the majority of society, and so, at least as far as we understand it, it has this ethical legitimacy. So, in some very specific circumstances, I agree that there might be a collision between medical ethics, strict medical ethics, and these more global bioethics, namely in countries that have approved some practices, and active euthanasia is one such example, but there could be other examples. Again, this is something for each one of us individually to reconcile. So I would say that the ethical behavior would be the right one if I follow my own conscience. So if there is even a medical ethics guideline regarding a specific practice, but in a state or in a country where the law, for instance, accepts a specific practice that is not totally in accordance with medical ethics, I would recommend, at least is what I do, that I would follow my own conscience, because there will be surely some ethical problems and some moral dilemmas in any circumstance. But I would feel that this would be the right choice. Secondly, I would say that probably, at least in countries that have developed in such a way that euthanasia is now legally accepted by the majority of the population, probably we will see in the future that medical ethics will conform to that practice. And if you see in countries that have approved euthanasia many years ago, probably not in countries that approved right now, such as Portugal or Spain, euthanasia, but in other countries, you'll see that the codes of medical ethics will allow for the deliverance and the practice of euthanasia. So this is something that societies will develop during the years, but my strong feeling is that in the future, medical ethics and bioethics and global ethics will be one and same thing. Well, this is, from my point of view, to be optimistic, but nevertheless, that's what I feel.
Thank you. So I believe we have time for one last quick question, which is, how can someone who is, for example, not studying medicine learn about health ethics? What is the best approach to learn and educate ourselves?
Well, I would speak about health ethics and also about bioethics, because health and bioethics, first of all, it is different, as it was seen in my previous words, from medical ethics, from traditional Hippocratical medical ethics. Traditional Hippocratical medical ethics is the ethics of physicians. The nurses also have their own ethics, etc. So every healthcare profession has a specific ethics that, when we speak about physicians, as I told, is an ethics that has more than 2,000 years old. But the main virtue of bioethics that was created, that was sought in the 70s of the last century, and then it was sought essentially, and in the beginning at the United States, by a very well-known oncologist, Van Potter. But in the last decades of last century, it exploded also in Europe. But the main virtue is not the fact that is a different approach of ethics, is also that its methodology is different. So this new biomedical ethics, bioethics, healthcare ethics, whatever the name you can call it, is by definition multi and transdisciplinary area. So I would claim that every single area of human knowledge, and of human endeavor would be important to bioethics. Just to give you an example, we have here a master and a PhD course on palliative care, and we have an architect that deals with these issues, because it is also an ethical important the way patients are architectonically dealt with in healthcare spaces. So, of course, law is very important in health ethics and bioethics. Economy, management of resources due to all principles of justice, of equity, of fair distribution of resources. But also other areas, all healthcare areas are important, of course, no doubt about it. So I would say that philosophy, psychology, engineering, all areas are very important, because ethics is something that deals with values, is a fundamental capacity of the human person. The human person is not only rational and emotional, is also an ethical subject. That's probably the main difference between human intelligence and artificial intelligence, is the ethics, the ethical reasoning. Many claim that the difference between natural human intelligence and artificial intelligence are emotions, but I feel that in the future, artificial intelligence will also develop emotions. What will be more difficult, it will be to develop this capacity to reason and decide according to values that are values of our own consciousness, and not the values that we learn and that may be in some specific algorithm. So from this point of view, I would claim that ethics and bioethics is really something regarding citizenship, full democratic citizenship. And that's why, for instance, in ethics committees, we always have members that are what we call laypersons, so people from society, from architecture, from psychology, no, from engineering, from any other areas not related to healthcare, but that have an insight as citizens, and they do have an ethical approach, although different from a healthcare professional. So I would say that bioethics now is plural, it is multidisciplinary, but is also transdisciplinary, in the sense that it is something that has its roots in all different areas of human knowledge and of human endeavor. So everyone is welcomed, and of course we can do specific training on these areas. And that's what we do at the universities. It's to train people, healthcare professionals and other professionals in these areas. For instance, in our PhD program in bioethics, we have many lawyers, but many lawyers. So it is not one or two specific cases. So, and other professionals as well. So, and this is valuable. It is not possible, for instance, to organize a master or a PhD in bioethics only with physicians. Of course, it is possible. It is not desirable, because we would be speaking in concentric circles between each other. So it is desirable to have different opinions, different views of society, of moral life, because it aggregates value, it adds value, and not the contrary.
Thank you for answering our questions. So with that, I believe it's time to wrap up today's session. And I would like to thank you very much, Professor Nunes, for being with us today, and also for our audience for following us and for posting your questions. So we are very looking forward to seeing you next week, next Wednesday, for the session titled Global Health from the Viewpoint of Economy. So I will wish you all a very nice evening. Goodbye.
Goodbye.